Welcome to CXOTalk, episode 851. I'm Michael Krigsman, and we're discussing leadership strategy and AI. Our guest is Kurt Strovink, senior partner at McKinsey Company, where he's head of the firm's global CEO services and a member of their board of directors. Kurt, tell us about your work at McKinsey, and you have a new book coming out. Tell us about that as well.
Our group's work has really focused on helping CEOs to achieve their full potential and role. And we actually think that's one of the biggest sort of opportunities, if you will, for global business. The book that's coming out, which is called The Journey of Leadership, How CEOs Learn to Lead from the Inside Out. It actually builds on some earlier work we did around CEO excellence, where we were taking a position on what does excellence look like for CEOs that are high performing, that have delivered a ton of value in terms of total return to shareholders and other metrics. The thesis of the book, in a nutshell, is that learning to lead others often involves having to first learn how to lead yourself. And there's a link between leading oneself on the one hand and leading others on the other. And the book explores the relationship between those two sides of leadership.
What I found particularly interesting about your book is the focus on what we might call soft attributes, being self-aware, being mindful, being collaborative. And of course, these are important attributes for anybody, both personally and in their profession. But you really focus on this for CEOs.
As you point out, Michael, it's kind of counterintuitive because you might say that the senior most integrating officer of a company is always in charge, has a strong form of clear leadership. But I think we did find that some of the best ones show traits of humility, of vulnerability, of learning to lead through others. And so these softer skills are really important. And sometimes when people suffer from those softer skills or they don't exercise them at the highest level they could, it's traced to ways of governing themselves that they're still learning, or how they react to stress, or how they react to ambiguity or complexity. And so we actually thought that there was a link as we looked at all of these hundreds of CEOs between those two sides. But it's strange because we come out of an era, maybe formally, that was kind of an imperial CEO era, where there was a belief that, CEOs were all-knowing and all-powerful. And I think we're definitely beyond that era. And now I think the expectations of CEOs with multiple stakeholders is different. And so I think that's part of why these softer skills are much more natural to put in scope. I also think people sometimes don't recognize the true value of the softer side. And in fact, we found as we've analyzed CEOs that operate at the top of their games, they often treat the soft stuff as disciplined matter as they treat the hard stuff of numbers. And they actually manage both sides. And they don't see it as soft. They see it as highly important for culture, for leadership development, and those kinds of things. So there's probably a number of reasons why the softer skills historically weren't as focused on as much, but I think have now come back into scope. And just given the change and rapidity of things in the world, I think the requirement for adaptability and change and agility in organizations and in individual selves as leaders has gone way up.
I can certainly say that having interviewed so many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of senior leaders from the largest companies on CXOTalk, one of the uncommon, or to me, what seemed surprising aspects is, in fact, the humility and the humanness of the folks who I would think are the best leaders that I've interviewed.
I find that too. I don't have the reach and span that you have with all your guests as CEOs, but I think that's true. I think it's really true. And it might be that, CEOs stand at an intersection where they get to see, the effects of leadership forms, and they learn over time. You'll often see this in the course of somebody's CEO tenure, where initially they might be still using the operating model from the role they came from before they were CEOs. And you'll see how they evolve that role sometimes in leading and learning. But I think you're right that humility, especially if it can be done in a decisive way where you're creating an open space for learning, and for not everything having to be perfect, and for continuous improvement. I think those kinds of skills go a long way to making organizations more agile, more bold, willing to take risks, and also learn how to respond.
When we talk about leadership, obviously disruption is a crucial part of that. And right now, we're facing this disruption caused by AI. From a leadership, a strategy standpoint, how are CEOs and boards of directors that you're speaking with relating to AI?
There's a number of thoughts that are on people's minds. I mean, one is to try to assess the full potential of what AI can do for their businesses. And I think that's partly a question of the businesses they're in, partly a question of the use cases that may be most accretive to their businesses, trying to isolate and identify those. So there's a question of kind of where is the opportunity greatest. That's very much in people's minds. I think strategically, there's also a question of, do I want to be a fast follower, or do I want to be out in front and lead on this? And sometimes people will think even in more terms. They'll say, do I want to be a taker, a maker or a shaper? Where in this continuum do I actually think benefits my business, my shareholders, my employees most? So I think there's a calibration question. And by the way, CEOs often deal with calibration questions. How much should we change? Is the extent of our change enough to matter? Those kinds of things typically are CEO-like things in my experience. But so I think it's very much also a question of just, do I want to lead or do I want to follow? There are a lot of questions as well around use cases are nice, but how do I actually industrialize this? So everybody has their 3, 4, 5, 15 use cases, but how do I actually scale something? And often I think there's therefore focus on what are the domains, larger areas of end-to-end processes that if I can add some AI and Gen AI too, I might be able to create greater business value. So that's a third question is how do I get the aggregation right here so that I'm not just doing individual use cases and pilots, but trying to actually scale and industrialize. In fact, we have part of our Quantum Black firm called Iguazio focuses just on that industrialization of use cases to do work in the domains. So I think that's another question. I think at fourth would be risks. Clearly, boards and management teams and CEOs are thinking about risks of AI, unfettered access to it, use on the front line of Gen AI. What is that okay? Should we ban it? Should we limit it? Should we put parameters around it? What areas are most ripe now for us to move into, and which ones we might defer until later when there's more learnings and experience with the concept. Typically, people will sometimes insulate aspects of the process that could involve customers directly until they get some things that are deployable on training for their employees or other areas. So it's a full range, Michael, of areas, I think, from strategic opportunities and stance to risks and trying to calibrate what this is. And I think there's also a lot of what's hype versus what's real. I'm sure we'll talk more about that too. But
We have an interesting question from LinkedIn, and this is from Michelle Clark, who has a question about one aspect of the risks that you were just describing, Kurt. And so she says, and I think also this has to do with the calibration that you mentioned. Where should a CEO draw the line in putting AI into operation when the data is overwhelming? She says, particularly in healthcare, that the data used to train the models is biased. Even she says criminally biased, but let's just make it broader, the issue of bias. How do CEOs that you speak with calibrate those distinctions of bias? Because it's not just a switch that you flip. This is biased or this is not. It's gray areas.
It's one that a lot of CEOs that I see, work through, and obviously it's different by context, but I think the ever-present reality of we could create bias with some of the tools we're using is really important. And what I see is A, being aware of it and being mindful of it. B, front-loading a framework, a risk framework that takes this into account at the ground floor, as opposed to a consideration at the end or after there's problems, is super important. I think third, sometimes looking outside the organization for independent validation. of approaches so that it's not just a decision made internally can be important. But I think it's a very important space. And it's also this is part of what's being learned and worked out, I think, by a number of companies and management teams. So it's an ongoing challenge, but a really important, I think, criteria. And not just because people are thinking that regulators and others will think about this, but I think they're genuinely concerned themselves about this as well. By the way, there's other risks as well that come out from this. I mean, one of the things that I find fascinating is a lot of, I think, pretty thoughtful CEOs and management teams are thinking, as we use particularly Gen AI more in our companies, how do we ensure that we onboard and develop, enroll people who used to kind of quote do it themselves as opposed to hit ChatGPT? And are we at risk of creating a generation that hasn't really learned and been apprenticed in ways that maybe the former generation has because they've been robbed of that ability by being so equipped with AI? And that's a fascinating question for sort of future leadership development that I think people are also thinking about, the sort of second bounce of the ball here on how do you both use AI, but also continue to look at that human capital equation over time for your people, and how are they developing, and are they getting the skills and requisite skills at each stage so that they can end up being senior leaders with enough reach and pattern recognition as well. So I think that's another, it's not really a risk per se in the sense of a regulatory risk, but it is a long human capital consideration that's quite strategic.
Please subscribe to our newsletter and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Kurt, as you're describing the various issues, it's very clear the level of complexity is just, it's almost astounding how complex and where the implications and the tentacles go and the number of directions. How are CEOs and boards parsing all of this? In some cases, there are conflicting goals as well.
It's definitely a space where just a show of hands or a democratic process is a difficult one. And I think what I've seen, Michael, is that people will try to set parameters around this. Clearly, there's a question of where to start. Where is it most ripe, where the business value is highest, and maybe the risks that we talked about earlier are lower or minimal or can be managed. So I think a really clear heat map of where the opportunities are in business terms relative to risks, I think is certainly one way to parse it and begin. I think there's another which is equally important, and sometimes people pass over, which is what's the story of how you imagine AI playing in your company over time? And nobody's going to have that fully fleshed out. But I think it's super important to think about the purpose and the meaning and the underlying message, because everybody is not sure, is this going to replace my job? Is this going to augment me? Are we not sure yet? And we'll see. And what's the thesis that we imagine? And how does this relate to our own strategy? I think CEOs and boards that get ahead of that curve, maybe with their senior teams leading them, will do much better to prepare the groundwork. And that's another way to parse it. I think I would do that earlier in the sequence, because it tends to be the kind of thing you increment into and wait too long to do. And then I think there's a lot of antibodies in organizations that will pop up because people aren't sure what this means and what it means for them. So I'd say that's another thing that you can do to parse is front load meaning, purpose, and an articulation of why. And then I think third, you can parse this a little bit by thinking about what's that multi-year roadmap? How do I graduate to other things? That's another thing that I see people doing, taking a little bit of a longer view of not just early use cases, but if you dial out 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, where can we imagine ourselves being? What does that roadmap look like? And then finally, I do think there's something important to just thinking through, what are some of the risks that we would just not want to get into from the very beginning, and how do we parameterize those and almost kind of isolate those as places we don't want to go. And probably also related to that, I think, how do you create optionality with a number of providers that are promising a lot and are also themselves evolving quite quickly? Every 2-3 months, there's something new. And so how do you create sort of optionality and not become beholden to any one area? I see people focus on that, but that's another way to parse it, is to say, what what things can we do now that we get higher strategic value from, maybe business return, risks are less. We're not offending some of the real risks that we're concerned about, but we're also preserving optionality. So if the world changes in 3, 6, 9 months, we're agile. Those are some of the things. But as you point out, Michael, it is a complicated question, probably as the length of my answer reveals.
To what extent do you see CEOs actually getting involved in the details of this list that includes so many different pieces? And to what extent is it simply delegated down for somebody else to handle and manage?
One of the things that we've been thinking about more broadly, we have some in this book, Journey of Leadership, but also in some other areas, is what are the sort of undelegatable roles of a CEO in different functional areas? And, because you shouldn't be resting on your team to lead in most cases, but what are the few things that a CEO needs to lean in themselves with? I think in the AI space, it's probably more around things like a decision on whether we want to lead or follow. Again, in consultation with a senior team and ultimately a board, et cetera. I think many more are deciding that they need to lead, that this may be an area where we cannot fast follow, actually. Fast followership is permanent laggardship. And they're worried about, this isn't like other areas where they can watch and then execute. They feel like they need to lean in more. And then that generates second questions. But I think that is a strategic question that a CEO does get involved in, usually. I think this idea of where within this landscape that we could focus are the highest and best uses, and making sure that we're not just doing a litany of use cases, but we're actually doing domains. I think that's super important, and for boards and CEOs to insist on. Usually, I think sometimes companies will content themselves because they're doing something. We're doing 4, 5, 6, use cases. They're going well, and the board feels, okay, we're doing something. And the CEO might feel, something's underway. We're having results, but that's, I think, insufficient. You really need to think about end-to-end processes, domains, as we call them, which are categories of use cases that cohere into business outcomes. And I would push for that and say that's a CEO responsibility too, to kind of insist on that aggregation standard. And then maybe, as we talked about before, and as was asked, I think that a very sharp view of risks, and at least to front load that and make sure that legal and risk and business and technology are actually working together on these questions, and that you've got sort of an empowerment across a number of parts of the organization is critical. And I'd finally say, this is an area where you have to have a learning mindset. You're not going to know everything at the outset. You're going to have to iterate and learn. I think role modeling that you're open to that as a CEO, that that's the space we're in. You show that that we're expecting to learn more as we go through this, I think is also something that the CEO, it's more of a tone that you can set at the top for learning and for encouraging people to be learners.
Much of what you're describing is part of the cultural fabric of an organization. And we have a question from Twitter on this topic from Arsalan Khan, who says the CEO's personality can lead the organizational culture, but CEOs often change every 3 to 5 years, leaving the culture in flux. How should an organization respond to these leadership changes?
First thing I would say to that is there's sort of a premise in that the culture will change as the CEO changes. And I think some of the best CEOs lead in a way that creates and institutionalizes things that exist and persist beyond their tenures. That's a tough act to do, but I think focusing on the 10-year standard, what can this organization do in 10 years that it maybe can't do today? How do we create systems and embedded processes and learning so that we can adapt? I actually think that some of the best CEOs outlive themselves in terms of the impact that they have and can have in organizations. And so, while I recognize the premise in the question, which is to say, look, CEOs are rotating a bunch. How do we not lose? How do we manage this as we try to move forward? At least our view is that CEOs should think about what happens after they leave and try to lead in a way that creates and sets up the next generation. In fact, that's something we talk a lot about in the CEO life cycle. We talk about stepping up when you're not a CEO yet. We talk about starting strong in your earlier years. We talk about staying ahead in ways that you have to up your game mid-tenure as a CEO. And we talk about sending it forward when you're actually setting up the next generation. And there's sort of a commitment to a through cycle mindset and much broader than just your tenure as a CEO that I think is about CEO excellence and leadership as well. So, but having said all that, it is still challenging as people change. What I would say is that thinking about those processes that are stable in an organization and that are going to be part of your signature strengths is really important. And I do see a number of CEOs and senior teams thinking about what's stable in my organization and what's agile, and trying to get a better understanding of the stable part. And then that's something that actually is meant to live on beyond individual tenures of CEOs. But it's a great and persistent question. And I think CEO tenures are only going to hold it where they are, maybe come down slightly, because of the speed of change in the world. And we know that, CEOs don't, a number of them don't even last 3 years. So it's a constant tension in some organizations.
One of the challenges with AI is it's very difficult to determine the distinction between hype and reality. And you combine that with the enormous investments that are required. And so, how are CEOs managing that bundle of issues?
I think it's true that part of what I said earlier around trying to make sure that you have optionality with the partners you work with, I think is important, because there are things that are rapidly changing day to day. We have a group in our own firm with some of our best people in analytics who actually monitor the environment and the ecosystem and are constantly trolling things and meeting with folks to understand what's a real application that's new and what's vaporware or not, doesn't live up to its propositions as stated. And there's a lot out there that has to be sorted through. I would almost say an organization needs that to be strong. And it's important to be able to constantly monitor this changing landscape of potential providers and partners. So I think one thing you can do is be mindful of optionality and partners that you can work with. And I think CEOs that ask their teams, how do we get optionality here in a commitment-rich way? But how do we get optionality so that we can evolve as the space evolves in 3 or 6 months? Super important, because I think you can make investments too fast, too soon in one major area or partner, and that can sometimes limit your strategic degrees of freedom downstream. I do also think that you have to have a strong ROI equation of investment and return in business terms, and this is something that I think technology leaders can help a lot with business leaders directly. But having a sense of what return will look like, which often leads people, as I mentioned earlier, to earlier areas where there can be that kind of impact. Training, for example, onboarding, getting somebody who's a 6-year person or a 3-year person to operate like they were a 6-year person with better training through AI. Those kinds of things tend to be more early, no regret moves. So those would be a couple things in the ways I think people think about investments, optionality, and maybe higher ROI return things earlier in the pipeline.
But what about the situation where the technology is moving so quickly and an organization feels that it must invest right now despite the uncertainty, or they may get left behind? And yet the cost of that investment is very high and the risk is equally high. How do they balance that?
Strategy definition is hard to reverse choices made under uncertainty that create enterprise value. And, the hard to reverse is what you're describing. Some of these things are not easy they're kind of one-way doors, not two-way doors in some cases. I think those elements of reasoning through what are the trade-offs, this is part of what's difficult, but ultimately what's most valuable in sort of senior teams reasoning through things. So I think the approach that I've seen practically that people work on is they look hard at the domains, not use cases per the earlier statement, of where the greatest value might be. They try to prioritize those. They try to put the risk overlay so that they're focusing on things that are less risky early. And then they understand that there's going to be iterative learning and they adjust as they go. And they try to create optionality with partners for the longer term. But they do realize that they need to commit and they do realize that they will need to invest and sometimes substantially, depending on their strategic context. So, but I think it's an interesting question you ask, because while I think it's particularly powerful in AI right now, it's actually, in some sense, the essence of strategy, which is to think about in uncertain environments, how do you make big, bold moves without betting the farm on bad decisions?
And Arsalan Khan on Twitter comes back again and wants to drill into this point. He said, in some cases, employees may just be tired of hearing the hype from their own marketing teams, even though the reality is very different. And where does that aspect fit in?
It's definitely true. I mean, it's hard for it not to be the case that especially Gen AI is it at a very, very high level of hype right now across all of business. And so I understand that sometimes there will be a fatigue factor that sets in with a number of folks. Having said that, usually what happens is even if it's slightly overhyped now, it's usually underestimated in the medium term. And so, if you just about the time when we're getting a little tired of hearing about it, the opportunities exist for many leaders and businesses to continue to innovate. And there's precedent for that in other technology transformations as well, from the dot-com era and from other areas. And even, electrification and things like that way back when took a lot of time to burn in. But once they burned in, they pretty much changed the world. And I think most people see AI and Gen AI as being like that. It's not going to be a brief, event that we overhyped. It's probably going to be something transformative, but it may take a little longer to get there than the energy and all the social media and even the commercial interests of firms would otherwise say. But I think the way to do it is persist, hold to what is changing, make sure there's a business tech interlock. Marketing is important. But I think the key is going to be this business value and technology's ability to deliver against that in a risk-adjusted way. And I would hold to the medium term and not get distracted by the short term.
That's a very interesting statement you just made. The business value enabled by the I'm paraphrasing, enabled by the technology, and then risk adjusted. That kind of encompasses a lot of the pieces.
I think it does. And that'll work out in different contexts. And every, senior team is going to have to look at that in their own way. But I think that would be, I would try to keep that as a North Star, understanding that there's going to be lots of people who are going to say it's overhyped. There's going to be other people who say we're not moving fast enough. The other risk, I think, of complacency is we think we're doing something on this because we have a few use cases or even a couple dozen. And, that's not the standard. Everybody has that. Nobody's not got use cases. But are you starting to industrialize the right ones? Do you have domains? Are you starting to affect business outcomes that involve multiple of these use cases in sequence? And that's where I see the real opportunity.
Kurt, there are a host of ethical issues associated with all of this. There are potential job displacements as a result of AI. There's customer privacy. We discussed the issue of bias. There's algorithmic decision-making and lack of transparency. How should business leaders, CEOs, thread this complex set of ethical aspects and governance aspects?
There really is an ethical dimension, I think, to leadership generally, but also CEO leadership, to think through these things, maybe see around corners a bit. Clearly think about what could go wrong, but somehow not make that something that paralyzes the organization. It's a very difficult balance to thread. If people are always worried about what can go wrong, it's oftentimes they're just idling and not moving. On the other hand, if they're not sufficiently imaginative about risks that can happen, then I think they're underserving the benefits of their senior roles. So I would just say that I think it's an ever-present challenge and trade-off. Sometimes senior-most executives, not just CEOs, I think they deal with the world of these kinds of trade-offs. They're the gray area ones that require judgment, maybe some imagination as well. I think imagination sometimes is as important as judgment and ethics around analytics and facts. It's the ability to imagine something that's not there and ask yourself, if it were there, would that change something? But I think it's equally important to not have the failure mode of just stopping and not starting this because it's risky and there's manifold risks. And we have seen situations, and I think CEOs would attest to this, where they are just in lockdown from their legal department and compliance and others, and they can't, move forward in some workable way because, of course, there's lots of risks. And so, how do you create the right bounded sort of kind of entrepreneurship? I think is a real test of leadership. It's a good way to define at least some elements of what modern CEOs need to do. And there's other things that are like that too, like taking a position on external issues with constituencies and speaking publicly about certain things and when to take a position, when not to take a position, when half the employees want you to do something, when half the employees don't want you to do something. How do you thread those needles? How do you reason morally through these kinds of things? And usually it's about creating a framework for what we do that is unique to us. And therefore, we're going to take positions on areas A, B, C, but we're not going to wade into the space of commenting on everything like public citizens, because that's beyond our maybe business model. But thinking through those kind of trade-offs, I'm just using that as another example, are similar to these AI risk trade-offs where you have to move forward, but you have to do it within a framework that you probably have to conceive and then syndicate.
Would it be fair to say that it's really the CEO's job to manage through these conflicting goals and sets of issues?
I've often thought that part of the role of a CEO is a chief calibration officer, that you do need to calibrate across these polarities or these tensions. In fact, one of the things in our Journey of Leadership book is about that all leadership involves trade-offs and how do you balance competing trade-offs. So it's a deep, deep thought in terms of human-centric leadership. And it arises when there's stresses on yourself as an individual before you can actually help lead others. But I do think you're right that part of the CEO role is the things that can't be resolved before they get to your desk. And those are typically things that have thorny, very difficult trade-offs. Or they have deep politics or something like that that requires, your attention. And I think that this concept of a chief calibration officer is to say that ultimately CEOs, informed and helped by their senior teams, I think need to have this question of, am I moving fast enough? And am I moving with enough extent? And that's a calibration question. And I think that is, to the first approximation, one of, if not coextensive with, the role of a CEO.
Now, talking about calibration and being stuck in a really hard problem, your book describes the story of Moderna's CEO and how they managed the onset of COVID-19. Would you tell us about that?
It's one of the 24 cases we share, because we wanted to be practical and also human in terms of the stories of how these individual leaders developed and grew. And it's a fascinating case where many will know Moderna succeeded in developing 1 billion doses, of their vaccine in record time by the end of 2020. And the leadership that was required to do that at a time when it wasn't believed possible to do that was quite substantial. And Stephen, I think, was a great example of somebody who was decisive, was bold, had high aspirations, put those forth, but also empowered his people. And there was one famous story where he was talking to his head of manufacturing, and he sort of said, how do we get to 1 billion, doses by the end of the year? And his head of manufacturing was like, there's no way to do that. And he said, sorry, let me rephrase myself. I've spoken correctly. What do you need for us to be able to do that? And I think that's an interesting moment where, he was empowering, but he was being very clear on the end goal and saying, I will move heaven and earth and do whatever on my side I can do. And there's a bunch of things that he in fact did do to create and underwrite the chance for us to do that. But it was decisive on the goal and it was unbridgeable on that, but it was also hugely radically empowering. And I think that's, it's a great story of a firm energizing itself, coming back to the FDA in 34 days and then being able to ultimately get to 1 billion doses, which did actually happen. And I think the side of that was quite magical. Interestingly, there were also moments though, where he and his team slowed down when they felt they needed to, and they needed to get more minority folks into their trials, for example. They slowed down to do that. And so they weren't just about speed at any cost. They had a quality element and an overlay, but they were able to manage a very high stakes moment for, human history with a strong, bold aspiration, with radical empowerment. And then maybe also this sense of purpose and story as to why, this is the championship league, everything's down. This is an exciting moment where we can do something for humanity. I mean, that was also pretty gripping. So it has a lot of elements, even though it's a very unique moment in time for us as a society. I think it's kind of a good case example of other things that in other ways we can try to get the balance of in other parts of leadership in our lives. And so that's why we told that story.
One aspect of the story in the book that I find so compelling is there were several bet the company moments, and it was one of these situations where the need was so great and they had to make a decision before they knew the likelihood of the outcome, which is very much like the AI issues we were talking about earlier.
The analogy to AI is a powerful one. I mean, you have compressed time frame, which in the Moderna case was COVID and the need for a vaccine. But in the AI case is this sense of just incredible speed, kaleidoscopic speed and evolution of this category at rapid rates, but needing to decide to do something. So I think you have this compressed time frame feature, which is quite similar in both cases. You also have this idea of empowerment and how to get the full organization to collaborate, in breakthrough silos, which happen in Moderna, but also is required, I think, in the AI space as well. This commitment to sort of iteration and learning, and we will figure it out together, and having some sort of bold vision. We've talked about that, over the time, together, just in these various conversations here. So I think there's a lot of analogies, and maybe also it's a place with risks, right, that have to be negotiated, but we can't be stymied by them. So we have to figure out a way through this forest. And I think that's similar too, as we've been talking about and you've been raising. So it is a provocative analogy for leadership, maybe in an AI setting, to think about the Moderna case more generally.
On this issue of calibration, we have a really interesting question from Elizabeth Shaw on Twitter, who says, how can CEOs work through the ethical issues of AI and take their organizations and the board through these issues when they must balance value and revenue?
Trying to get that balance right, where you're having a full-throated conversation about business value, but also attendant risks, and some way to say, here's how we've racked and stacked the business opportunities, and we've aggregated them, again, back into domains, not use cases, but that we've also looked at the risks, and not just the first order risks, but the second and tertiary risks, because there's some things that can bite you that, are secondary and tertiary. I think you need those two lists, and you need to looking at things that are high on one side and low on the other. And that's how I've seen CEOs and boards in companies that have really pursued this well, I think, step through this. What they try to do is discipline it with facts, and discussion of what's known and not known. And then they try to iterate and commit to a culture of learning. And they try to get external validation involvement in some way, so that it isn't just, we're only listening to the people who know this space inside of our company, right? And the rest of us are sort of getting updated. It has to be a much deeper exploration with the full team, the full company. And I think also external partners, whether they be technology partners or others, to help illuminate what's possible. I also think that organizations can use challenge sessions, and they can bring people together and they can say, let's look at this. Like, let's poke holes in this. Let's ask ourselves the question. Sometimes people do things called pre-morteming, where they'll say, if this were to fail, why did it fail? Let's go around the table. Everybody give me your reason. And the kind of insight and wisdom you can get from teams reasoning like that is huge for troubleshooting things. And sometimes the results of that can be shared with the board. And I find that boards will be very interested to see that a management team has thought through those and has used its full intuition and across multiple people to think through some of these. But it's not easy. And the question's a great one, because I think it's going to be one of the key questions going forward. But I believe that balancing those things is at the very, very heart of senior leadership.
And when it comes to AI, there's so much uncertainty. The technology is evolving so quickly. We know that AI will be very important, but we don't know exactly how important or where the ultimate implications will fall. How will it affect jobs, for example? We know it's going to, but precisely where we don't know. And I think that it makes it very, very difficult for the CEO as well as other senior leaders inside the company.
Absolutely. And I just keep going back to thinking, like, hard to reverse decisions made under uncertainty that create enterprise value. We offer that often as a definition of strategy, but all of those three terms apply to AI. Hard to reverse, made under uncertainty, and it will create enterprise value. So we have to navigate through that complex equation, exactly as you said, Michael.
What do CEOs want from these senior technology folks?
I see a lot of CEOs asking for business tech interlock. So what I'm really interested in is business and technology coming together and together coming up with a roadmap, a plan, return on investment, and a plan. I get worried when I see the technology group as a fulfillment entity only and not a co-creator. And I get worried when the business isn't investing to understand technology and considers that IT as opposed to technology. And I really want the business interlocks. And I'm sort of demanding that of my folks, and I'm trying to get the business leaders to operate that way and become more tech fluent, and the technology leaders to become more business savvy and feel like it's their role to orchestrate outcomes and co-create, build paths with businesses. So that'd be one thing I would say for sure. I think a second is sometimes it's to have the leadership capabilities to be able to create collaborative dynamics and lead people to outcomes when you don't directly control them. I mean, I think there's a human capital side of this, like a leadership element to this, but I think they do look for their technology leaders to step up in human-centric leadership terms. By the way, a lot of that is related to the journey of leadership. Become more collaborative, better listeners, show more vulnerability, all the things that is true more generally, I think applies to technology leaders for sure. I think there's a third that's, can you help demystify and simplify technology for the board? And can we isolate and reduce things to their essences so that business people can understand it, or generalists can understand it who are smart, as opposed to you have to be deeply technical and you have to have a lot of technocratic knowledge to even understand what we're talking about. I think that's another capability which I think most CEOs and boards would really appreciate from their technology leaders. And when they see it, those technology leaders are very influential because they're translators between business and tech, and they can explain how we move forward in this world. I think maybe another part that people would look for is, I have seen a lot of cases where a firm has a strategy, and then a firm also has a tech strategy, and the two aren't particularly linked, or as much as linked as you'd want them to be, certainly given the throw weight of technology for the strategy overall. And so I think technology leaders need to be not just conversant in, but students of the broader strategies of the firms that they co-lead, and be able to describe why under this strategy, enterprise strategy, we're going to do technology this way, whereas in another one, we might do it another way. And oftentimes, it sounds very basic, but I think that's not always synced and linked, at least in the CEO's eyes. So those would be 3 or 4 things that, again, pattern recognition. I don't know, you've probably seen some other things too in the course of other CEOs that have talked to you and your own research.
There have been a relatively few number of CIOs, CTOs, chief data officers at large organizations that have equal footing on the technology side and the business side. I've interviewed a few of those people on CXOTalk, but I think the problem is that the technology career path is focused on technology. And the business career path is focused on, of course, running a business. And there are very few people who have equal grasp of both. And I think that is a kind of, I think you raised that issue, but it kind of gets fundamentally to the point as well.
I can think of 3 CEOs in the last 7 or 8 months who have said to me about their succession that they are considering heads of technology as in the frame, and they wouldn't have 5 years ago. And so it's interesting. I think your point about career pathing is really important. It's also interesting that we're starting to pick up the importance of CIOs, in some cases, being considered CEOs in the future, and people, in terms of talent, imagining that career path will happen. So if it happens there, we've got to back up and ask, how does this occur earlier on to get that kind of business fluency? And also just ability to build bridges across the organization to get things done in agile ways that involve both technology and business. But I love that point. But it just occurred to me that it's the first time in maybe the last half year to year I've heard of CEOs explicitly talking as much about technology leaders being in the succession planning process too.
On this issue, we have a question again from Arsalan Khan, a really interesting one. And he says, not all CEOs are tech savvy. How should CIOs create trust with the CEO in order to deploy these emerging technologies? And he wants to know, does it matter where the CIO reports? Should he report to the COO, CFO, CEO, board, someone else?
Some of building capability and trust, I think, with chief technology officers, sometimes chief digital officers, with CEOs, is about creating journeys of discovery. And usually that's experiences, not PowerPoint decks. It's references, it's talking to other people, it's convening people to speak that might be in your network. It's expanding the ambit and the field of vision for a CEO or sometimes a board by inviting folks in who can talk about either the state of the art in different places in your category or beyond. I think that's a big part of it, is create experiences. A lot of people will discuss facts analytically and bring business cases and things, and then there's a predicate that's missing, like the missing premise. What do I have to know in order to appraise this? And they don't get into the missing premise. But then there's also insufficient attention towards learning and experiences as opposed to just facts and recommendations. And so I think if you can take your CEOs on journeys of discovery, if you can, sometimes that's inbound, sometimes it's outbound, but I think that's a big part of developing conviction and experience. That may be one idea that I would offer. I think also, I do think communication is really important, and being able to find the right elevation for speaking to CEOs and boards. It has to be clear. It has to be, not dumbed down, but it can't immediately get into detail that's not necessary for the discussion that's being had. And I think that learning to elevate the dialogue and frame it in the right way is a task for every business leader. It's actually it's an executive skill. But I think it's particularly important for technology leaders to master. And because there's so much content and technocratic knowledge that they have that others don't, it's tempting to move into that space too quickly.
Earlier, when I described those unique individuals, relatively few, who possess both deep technology skills together with deep business skills, what I left out was the glue that you just mentioned, which is excellent communication skills.
And I think in large organizations, it's super important. By the way, the other thing I would say is role modeling that you're learning continually, and that you don't see yourself as the resident expert on every topic immediately. It's a form of humility. It's a form of vulnerability, but used to an end that helps lead other people, much as we talk about in the journey of leadership. But I think those skills can double count in the technology space, because precisely when you're not, only relying on your expertise in one domain, but you're bridging to, show that you're continually learning, et cetera, you're demanding that of people, and others are going to have to grow as well. And here's how we can do this together. I think that those are powerful ideas. One other thought I've long been interested in, especially in innovation areas and disruption areas. I think that some of the most powerful things that motivate people to take action are when they see analogies in other industries that they think that they might be able to apply to their own. So I think a technology leader can also be a student of where else is technology and business interlock happening at scale and to great benefit, and why is it working there, and what would it mean for us to do it here? And maybe we get to know those people, maybe we bring them in, maybe we talk to them. And I think that's kind of goes under the heading of expanding learning and creating discovery paths. But I think the analogy to other places is a very powerful way to build conviction. Technology leaders, in my estimation, should be much more focused on analogies than they are.
What advice do you have for boards of directors when it comes to this whole AI situation?
I think one would be helping a management team to decide on this strategic stance of how fast do we believe we need to move in this space. Again, subject to risks, as we talked about, but a little bit enter that calibration conversation that's the unique preserve of the CEO. Like, be part of that discussion. How fast is it that we need to move? Why should it not be faster? Why should it not be slower? Like, have the discussion as a board. Calibration is super important on this. In all strategy matters, in my humble opinion, but particularly in the AI space. I think second, you've got to get above the use case level that's table stakes, but sounds to uninitiated people like we're making a lot of progress. And we've got to get to that aggregation. I call it domains. Other people may call it other things that are aggregations that lead to real business outcomes. And I think boards can challenge, motivate, and expect to know which are the domains, right? These are individual use cases that are nice, but individually they're not going to do much. What are the ones that cohere, 6 or 8 or 10 of them together, that are going to build a business outcome? Which are those? And I think they can push that question, and that'll be a very useful one. I think third, I think being kind of like role modeling learning and a capacity for learning and an understanding that we're in a space that's going to be iterative. We're going to have to have adaptive leadership, and celebrating the fact that people are going to step forward and maybe in the right way and with syndicated risks and bets, and maybe not everything's going to play out perfectly, but that's okay. I think boards can spend some time showing that they're aware of that environment we're in. And it's a little bit like modern leadership generally, but I think it takes particular expression in AI, and they can do a lot to show that we are interested in entrepreneurship and proactive leadership, but we want to be thoughtful about risks, but we know we're not going to get it right the first time. And we as a board are patient as long as we see that learning and we encourage that, and we're role modeling that. I think that's really, really important also with CEOs. And then the fourth thing, at least for boards, I would say, is be wary of over applying whatever you think you know from 5 and 10 years ago in this space, honestly. The overreach effect of a board with a bad analogy in this space, it can be quite problematic. And many board members, they're trying to add value. They're not trying to do anything wrong, but they go back to their experience base. And those things, I would just put an extra level of filter on the analogies you think are relevant in the AI space. You may be right. You may have unique insight, but you may also lead folks astray, or you may quash innovation because you get nervous about a variety of things you read in the Times or something like that. And that's not necessarily helpful as much to management teams.
What do CEOs want from middle managers, and what advice do you have for middle managers?
I think for middle managers, boy, is that last mile of execution critical. Getting AI and other parts of technology innovation to really walk to the front line and influence change there's so much value in that, I think, for organizations. I think the middle managers play a huge role in being able to create those conditions. So I think they're super important for that reason. I think they can also help institutionalize what works around here with standard work and kind of continuous improvement like contexts. They can create systems of replicable processes that make companies better. Back to your question about when leaders leave, like what's left? Well, what's left is these processes that are institutionalized, but oftentimes the middle management is the place where that happens or doesn't. So I think they play a huge role there. I think they're culture carriers. And when they're committed to self-development and learning and iterative learning, and let's call it proactive leadership within an appropriate adult-like view of risk, I think that's super important to the cultures that we need in high-performing organizations. So I would have said those are some of the pieces of advice. And then I would actually, humbly, I would say, take a look at the 6 practices for governing oneself that we came to in this laboratory of 500 plus CEOs over 10 years, and the 6 other elements of leading folks externally that we think are not unlinked to those self-oriented parts, and just see for yourself, what's your own self-awareness about these things? Where do you think you are strong? Where are you mindful? Where are you less so? And are there opportunities for you in your leadership with others that might come from better governing and practicing yourself on your own leadership? And I think if more people did that, I think there could be real waves in companies that would be quite productive for energy and for leadership.
Here is Kurt's book. And with that, a huge thank you to Kurt Strovink. Kurt, thank you so much for being here. I'm so grateful for your time today.
No, thank you, Michael. was a great to hear your questions and really think about it, and also the audience questions as well.
Everybody, thank you for watching, especially you folks who asked such excellent questions. Before you go, please subscribe to our newsletter and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can notify you of, we have really amazing shows coming up this fall. So check out CXOTalk.com. Everybody, thank you so much, Kurt, and have a great day. Take care.